I'm starting things, and we're recording, by the way. And give it a minute here. Well, I'm not seeing people come in, but let's go ahead and do the beginning. Go ahead, Dan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Duty. I'm an events coordinator at University Bookstore in Seattle, Washington. And I'd like to welcome you all to our event tonight, Cate Holahan in conversation with Vanessa Lillie. Thank you all for supporting a local independent bookstore. University Bookstore is the oldest independent bookstore in the region. In fact, we are celebrating our 121st anniversary this year. We have a fun event for you tonight. Cate will be discussing her new novel, Her Three Lives, with Vanessa Lillie. And if you have any questions, please add those to the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom screens, and we'll get to those at the end of the event. In Her Three Lives, in the novel, In Her Three Lives, a family must determine who the real enemy is after everything more, obviously, because spoilers and all that. And copies of the book are available to purchase via the links in the chat, and we will be via the links in the chat we're posting. Cate Holahan is a USA Today bestselling author of domestic suspense novels, The Widower's Wife, One Little Secret, Lies She Told, and Dark Turns. In a previous life, she was an award-winning journalist, writing for The Record, The Boston Globe, and Business Week, among others. And Cate is in conversation tonight with Vanessa Lillie, originally from Miami, Oklahoma, where she spent a lot of her childhood investigating local ghost stories at the public library, which I think is very cool. That's why I mentioned it. And she currently calls Providence, Rhode Island home, and is the author of 2 novels, Little Voices, and most recently, For the Best. And now I'm going to turn the stage over to Cate and Vanessa.
All right, thank you for having us. We're excited to be here, even though it's virtual, and we know everyone's getting a little bit of virtual fatigue, but we hope that that will be entertaining and telling you about writing and books. So I figured, Vanessa, we would just start it off with giving them a little bit of a rundown of our latest, and then take it from there.
Sounds great. Why don't you kick it off?
Okay, so Her Three Lives, my latest book, tells the story of Greg Hamlin. He's a 52-year-old architect, successful guy. He meets Jade Thompson, a 32-year-old would-be interior designer who has a kind of well-trafficked blog on Caribbean home design and lifestyle and food and all of that. So she's an influencer, and they get together and they're about to start this new chapter of their lives when they're the victims of a home invasion during which Greg is struck over the head with a crowbar and suffers a traumatic brain injury. So he's stuck at home, like so many of us can relate to, and he can't leave without a helmet, and he puts all of these cameras all over his house to try and protect himself and his fiance, and starts inadvertently spying on his wife-to-be, and then more deliberately spying on her as he begins to wonder whether she had anything to do with this break-in that nearly cost him his life. And he's kind of aided in his suspicions by his adult children from his prior marriage, who are really wondering kind of what this woman really wants from their father. So that's the story, and the tension is all about technology blurring the difference between our public, private, and secret lives. And so, Vanessa, you take it away.
I love it. And it's such a wonderful book. I was so happy to get an early read of it, Cate, because it's fantastic. Cate and I have just recently worked together. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit, but she's an absolute expert in plotting, which as thriller readers, you'll know is like one of the most important ingredients. So definitely pick up Her Three Lives because you're going to love it. It's so good. So my most recent book is called For the Best. You can kind of see it over my shoulder. It's set where I live now in Providence, Rhode Island. And it's the story of a woman who wakes up one morning brutally hungover and there's a knock at her door. She goes downstairs and there's a cop there holding her wallet from the night before, which she cannot remember. And suddenly she finds herself the only suspect in a murder investigation. So to prove herself innocent of the crime, she begins her own investigation, believing the police need to look, other ways besides her. And she actually starts a vlog, which is like a video blog, investigating the crime, trying to track down facts, getting help from other people, and generally running amok all over town. And this story for me was an exploration of privilege, specifically white female privilege, what we expect to work out for us, and why we expect things to always work out for the best, and what it looks like when our privilege is slowly stripped away.
Wow. Yeah. And that first chapter and that ending line of the first chapter, Vanessa, I mean, it's just like, I don't want to spoil it because I feel that people should really just get in there and read it, but it has one of those ending lines where you're like, it's so good. So good. So happy that you could do this with me. And I know we've talked in the past, we like research. And I know for this book, you actually talked to some police officers, right? And said like, what would you figure this out? How would you, right? How did you kind of do that?
Well, I was pretty nervous because, there's just kind of one main crime at the center of the story, and it's a man who was murdered, and there are no witnesses, and it kind of happened in a dark alley, and he was hit over the back of the head. And, you watch a lot of Law and Order and CSI, and you kind of think, well, maybe I sort of know what I am doing. But then when you really sit down, I was like, oh, I've got to like talk to an expert. So a local Providence detective was nice enough to sit down with me for coffee. And I kind of just walked him through the crime and asked him, would you tell me like what steps you would take and what kind of outcome do you see? He's hit over the head and there aren't really any witnesses. And he's like, listen, first of all, this would take forever. He's like, we're not going to get any DNA. We're not going to have a weapon. He's like, if it's like a brick, we don't know what brick it is. He's like, so it'll take forever. He's like, so slow it all down. And really, you don't even need to worry about my main character basically being arrested soon. He's like, she's never going to get arrested. Nobody's going to go down for this crime. We have no evidence. And so I was like, oh, okay. Cause I was worried that like, I don't know, she would be hauled away right away or so. It was a relief, but yeah, also a little disturbing to find out how easy it can be to get away with murder.
Yeah. I mean, it's great. I've been really kind of pleasantly surprised with how willing police officers are to talk to thriller writers. Mm-hmm. I had a similar experience, not with this book, but with my prior book, One Little Secret, where I wanted a female detective. And so it was actually a little bit difficult because there aren't many female police officers. They're not the majority. And then to also have one that then goes in as a detective. So I found one, and she let me like shadow her for the day, and we talked about the kind of cases she gets. And I was really kind of interested that the female detectives are the ones they often put on either sexual assaults or a lot of crimes involving violence against women, because and it makes sense, right? In some of these cases, the woman has been victimized by a man, and so then having like a big male police officer come in there is kind of re-traumatizing when they've just felt that their power was taken away by somebody that was kind of physically more domineering than they were, right? And so the female police officer, I mean, she was very fit, but she was still a woman, and compared to like a 6'4" guy, she was like a 5'3" woman. So you could see how just her physical presence allowed a certain level of comfort, which I thought was interesting. And it kind of showed you, I think sometimes when the same standards are used for jobs, that people aren't thinking, well, what are something else that might be like soft and not on the test, or not, easily done with like the physical exam, like how fast you can run or whatever it is, that would be beneficial bringing in different kinds of people, right, into these careers. And so just the fact that, yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, she's a smaller person, and people feel more comfortable talking about when they've been assaulted to someone that they just don't feel that intimidated physically by.
Mhm.
So
That
I thought
totally-
that was so interesting.
yeah.
And then I know, I'm sorry, Vanessa, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I also love that you did for Her Three Lives research, talking like looking into the kind of traumatic brain injury. That's such a fascinating area. Do you want to talk a little bit about like that research
sure.
and surgeons and doctors and all kinds of things?
Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised. Thank goodness for YouTube. Like Johns Hopkins put the entire cranioplasty surgery on the web, like soup to nuts, where that, I mean, it was hard stomach wise. I had to probably put it on pause multiple times, but they really do take you through why they do it, what areas of the brain would be impacted, and then what you would be likely to see. And I mean, they really almost have like a whole course. I guess it's to kind of try and encourage people who want to study neurosurgery to go through their program. But or maybe if you're thinking of where you're going to get your cranioplasty, although my guess is, but if you needed one, it's probably whoever's closest that can do it, right? But yeah, so it's so interesting. And then I got to speak to some doctors, particularly not so many neurosurgeons, but I did get to speak to some psychiatrists who have done extensive studying of the brain and could say, well, you want the injury to happen like here, because if it happens in the frontal cortex, they're going to have all these speech issues, and so I wanted the injury for my character to be something where he's physically affected, his balance is affected, his ability to to get up and not kind of see stars, and so he feels physically vulnerable, but I wanted him to still be able to converse with all his faculties, and then I wanted just some of the trauma of like the PTSD of having that kind of an attack. And so it's interesting because with Greg, I felt like he always, I mean, you meet him and he's attacked the first chapter, right? That's why it's not a spoiler. So he's really going through this whole book, and you have to kind of ask, what's his baseline personality? Because I don't really get to reveal it since he's attacked from chapter 1. You get this glimpse of who he is, and then you get other characters kind of trying to fill you in, but you don't, you're introduced to somebody when they're already kind of pretty damaged. And so how much sympathy do you have for that character? How much sympathy should you have for him, given that he has this injury? How many of his problems kind of predated what happened? And so that's one of the hopefully fun things for the reader to try and figure out when they're deciding where their loyalties lie. And I because we've talked about this before, just that the books we write, we have to write characters who at any point could flip to the antagonist. You're trying to kind of keep your reader off balance and go, well, yes, you like them and they're interesting, but are they capable of doing something pretty terrible? And that's such a tightrope, isn't it? Because we have to make them likable and interesting enough that people want to read the story, but also at the same time make it so we're never pulling the rug out when we're like, well, we kind of put these things in there, so it makes sense why they could be capable of something that's not so great. And how do you navigate that, Vanessa, like that balance?
Well, I do think it is tough. I find there's also this kind of question of what do I like as a reader?
Right.
And then what are my expectations of my readers? So, I think as a reader, I identifying with the character is somewhat important, but to me, I could follow a really dark and twisted character if they're fascinating, which is that's not true for everyone at all, actually. A lot of people really need, to kind of somewhat identify with a character or, be able to see some part of themselves in them. So I think it can be a balance, but you do have to sort of stick to kind of who your character is and the book, what you think makes the book, the most interesting. And I think it's cool because in thrillers, and particularly we're in the sort of domestic suspense area of thrillers, I think we are given a lot of leeway with who's good and who's bad, versus like if you were to pick up probably a Jodi Picoult or, a a more, maybe a women's fiction, you have some level of trust, I think, in the character. But if you pick up a domestic suspense where like the husband gets killed, like
Right.
you just know it could be the wife
Yeah.
or whatever, right? Like
it could be,
it just
or the
could
kids
be.
or the neighbors, or yeah.
It's like, that's just sort of part of the deal. So, I think we do have to make our characters nice. And some of it is so that the readers will enjoy it, but some of it too is to trick them so that they're surprised when they find out.
And then when they and then you just hope that at the end of the book you're like, well, I told you I was a snake, like, right, like
yeah, there were hints everywhere.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
it is, and it's different than police procedurals where even if the police officer has like a problem, there's kind of an expectation that this is the good guy trying their best to solve the crime and you're going along with them. And in what we do, like, maybe someone is ostensibly trying to solve the crime, but doesn't really want it solved or doesn't, right? And it's always it is a balance. And it's why I love our genre, because I do feel like I'm reading something where everyone could be a suspect, and I have that reserve of trying to like people, but at the same time, like, kind of look at them askance. It's like, okay, but what are some of the things that you've done that might be a little off? And I think that's the fun of it. And I think that for fans of the genre, that's also the fun of it for them,
And especially for, readers, like they really are so smart and often read so much that, you really have to push yourself to make it believable, but at the same time to really, make it exciting. I mean, to me, exciting is almost more important than believable, because they, you really, people pay to sit down with your book and they're giving you their time, and like, I don't know, I think you really want to just like push the gas and try to give them something kind of shocking or extraordinary or terrifying. Because I think that's kind of what they sign up for when they, pick up a domestic suspense, thriller type book.
It is, and we have a good one coming out with the Audible book, The Young Rich Widows, because talking about pushing the envelope with that. You are very good with that. You'd be like, well, what if? I love writing because I do feel like I'm like a little bit surgical with my plots, and I'm like, okay, and then this and this, and then you would always throw me a curveball, and you'd be like, but what if they were at a party with wolves and tigers? And I'm like, okay, wait, can we do that?
Yes, that's how my brain often works. Yes. The Young Rich Widows is a project through Audible Originals that Cate and I, and then two other authors, Kimberly Bell and Lane Fargo, were all working on a quarter of the book. And so in the end, it will be a normal length book, but we each kind of wrote a piece of it. And it's set in 1980s Providence. It's about four women, newly widowed, whose partners went down in a plane crash under mysterious circumstances. And suddenly they inherit the firm and all the problems that come with it, including mafia, shady business dealings, ties to all kinds of complicated problems. And they're just like suddenly in the middle of it. And I think mostly that was like, we really wanted to think about 80s fashion and music.
Yeah. And I think we want to do a send up of like the 80s legal thriller, right?
So,
like bring back the 80s legal thriller. It was, and so yeah, I love that project. And one great thing about setting it in the 80s too was we didn't have the COVID question,
yes.
right? We got to just sit there and say, okay, we are not going to think right now about whether the characters are wearing masks or how they deal with this, because that's something obviously as writers we're all thinking about now. I just missed it with this book because I was editing during coronavirus, but I think the idea was kind of people don't necessarily want their entertainment to reflect back their current exact struggle. So this one, other than Greg being stuck in the house, it doesn't really delve into it. But I think, we're all thinking about, well, what about the 2022 books in 2023? Like, I mean, what we usually do is a bit contemporary fiction. It's supposed to reflect our world, and like how do we have something like a pandemic, which normally is its own storyline, and then put that as the backdrop for a thriller. So yeah, I mean, so what do you think you're going to do with upcoming books? Do you think you're going to touch on it? Not set in different
So
eras?
the one I'm working on now is set in 2008, so I don't have to worry about it. And then, you know, for future books, maybe, but I, you know, I do think we are hopefully getting a little bit out of this. And so, you know, it's possible you might mention she takes off her mask and sits down for dinner or something, but I don't, you know, I don't know that it's going to necessarily be, you know, something that I have to like really focus on, assuming I said it, you know,
Right.
far enough advance. But like you're writing a book right now that's like
Yeah.
right in the thick of it. And it's so clever and smart because there were so many complications around COVID. So talk a little bit about how you're kind of using it in your next.
Well, yeah, the idea of the book is that there is an eviction moratorium because of the pandemic, and these people take in, because of their own financial problems. The husband is a chef, and his restaurant is closing, and so they take in this woman and her daughter and they start to wonder whether she had anything to do with this prominent couple that was murdered in the neighborhood, who were their good friends, and they can't get rid of her because they can't evict her, and she is not leaving because she has, you know, nowhere really to go. And so that's the tension there, is you have everybody in the same house, and you don't know, because, you know, psychological thrillers, you don't know kind of who's perceiving things correctly, and is she responsible for the murder, and they really should be doing everything they can to get her out of there, or are there things that she's not being as forthcoming with because she's sensitive about some of the class differences between herself and the people that are pretty wealthy that are renting out. I mean, they're now struggling financially, but they've been wealthy for a while. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, what are some of the tensions there that might be leading her to not be as forthright, that then people are, you know, getting more worked up than they need to be. Or she could be a murderer. That's the deal.
That's right. I mean, it's, you know, I love a kind of a locked room mystery, and that is sort of what we've all been living in for a year. Is our own little locked room horror story. You know, but you know, there are definitely some really fascinating parts of what we've all been through that lend itself to great fiction. And I think I'm reading a book right now that's kind of a writing craft book, and it's called Story Genius by Lisa Krohn. And she says in it that the reason we read is to understand what could go wrong in our lives. Mm-hmm. Like it's a form of protecting ourselves. Like if, you know, and so I think for a lot of people, we are going to kind of want to reflect on COVID, not in a, like, I'm going to sit down and read maybe a nonfiction book right now, but, you know, to take different aspects of it and see kind of what could have happened, I think is so fascinating because, you know, we do want to know, whoa, what, I mean, we could have had someone come, you know, rent out our house and do an Airbnb, or, you know, like, I just think that that's not that far-fetched. And that's why, like, and that's part of why domestic suspense is also so popular and grown in popularity, is because it's not saving the world, it's saving your marriage, or, you know, finding a killer next door,
or paying attention to the kids, or like, right?
It's all close and more familiar because you can so easily put yourself, you know, I can't be Jack Reacher. It's fun to read, but that's not like me imagining me being him.
Right.
But, you know, someone in your average suburban town with the, you know what I mean? The PTA problems or whatever it is, like that's sort of the hook of so much of domestic suspense. And so I think, you know, using different parts of what happened to us during COVID, you know, to explore that is going to be really fascinating. And for people like me who aren't quite ready to like read, you know, like a nonfiction or even a literary would be hard, I think, just personally right now.
Yeah.
But I love the idea of starting to process it through what we're reading. And, you know, I think thrillers will be a great place for that.
Yeah, I hope so. I always joke that I write from a place of anxiety. Like when they say, where do you get your book ideas? I go, well, I think of something that's been bothering me. And then I go, okay, let me just throw myself into it, because that it's like a way to stop the looping thought of like, well, what if? And for this book, Her Three Lives, that was definitely something with, I was concerned about a few things. One, just how much pressure I feel to kind of share my private life publicly, because, you know, we're all selling books and we have to like populate our social media. And so there was this blurring of like, well, when I show me on Mother's Day with my kids, is that a violation of their privacy, or is that just sharing my life? And kind of how do you navigate that? And then on top of that, I have all of these cameras that so many of us have, these like Nest cams and Ring doorbells, and I have them in my house. I've had them since the kids were little, so I could kind of make sure nobody woke up in the middle of the night and kind of, you know, was confused and fell down the stairs instead of trying to get to mommy's room, you know. And I left them in there. And now my kids are 9 and 11. And I will sit there and say things like, well, I can figure out who left the towel on the floor. Like I will go to the tape. And I just think, oh my goodness, that probably is somewhat psychologically damaging in and of itself. And so there was kind of my own discomfort with, I love technology and I love the convenience of all of these things, but then where do I personally draw the line? And I think what often happens to myself, and I think to others, is that we always err on the side of convenience until there's something that goes wrong, right? It's always like, well, but I can see my whole house from, you know, when I'm on vacation and check everything. So why wouldn't I have all of this stuff? And we don't necessarily think, well, what if someone tapped into it and they could see your whole house, right? Or, you know, we think of it when we're sharing online, it's like, well, I'm just trying to, you know, be entertaining, and I'm trying to also let people know about the things I write, but let them maybe know a bit about me and what interests me, in hopes that if we have similar interests, they'll look out for my books, which makes perfect sense. But we kind of don't think, then what happens when somebody starts following it and they actually have no real interest in your books, but they're very interested in you, right? And you have to wonder kind of why. Or, you know, I worry because I have 2 girls that are getting older now that I still put in a lot of my social media. And I think, you know, at some point I'm going to have to say, okay, maybe they're teenagers. I cut that off, you know?
It's all such new territory, you know, and I think we both use technology in those, as you were just explaining, like really interesting ways, because it's, again, things that we're sort of very much dealing with in our like real day-to-day life, and questions around privacy, questions around, you know, if they drop the towel on the floor, do you know, is it better for them to like lie to you and have to work through their own guilt? Or it's, you know, but like it's a, I don't know the answer to it. Or is it better to, you know, teach them to tell the truth? I don't know. And I'm sure you could get books with different opinions about it, but there's no answer. There's just doing the best you can. And so I love it that in, you know, fiction and in thrillers, especially, we can really lean into, like you said, the anxieties we have and explore them as far as we can go, to just almost like run through the tape, to like go through all the could be's and would be's and like what we would do. And I, you know, back to that book I was reading, I do think it does have something to do with our just primitive need to survive and to think about terrible things that could happen to us in case they do.
It's true. And I also think, you know, I think particularly with domestic suspense, it's going to be an interesting time for them, because I think we're all questioning truth too, and how we all perceive what's real, and that so many of us don't feel like we're operating with the same set of facts that somebody else is operating with. And so if you can't agree on the base facts, well, then you can't really have a debate, right? Because everyone is just talking about their perception of the world. And so in some ways, what we do with domestic suspense, that's the problem for a lot of our characters, is that there isn't a base set of facts where they're all operating from and going, okay, well, we can at least agree on this. It's everything's from somebody else's viewpoint and perception, and they don't agree on what those base facts are. And so, and then there's a lot of horrible things that happen because of it.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting time. And I do think that there is this kind of desire to play some of that out and see how these stories resolve themselves, maybe for some sort of self-preservation.
Right.
Yeah.
And for the best too, it's like, I wrote the vlog thing, and because I'm really interested in the ways in which clips and YouTube and what we view and like how that actually really influences us. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a whole, like, if you get into like jury selection stuff, there's this whole huge expensive area of picking a jury. And, part of it is like how much of the TV have they been viewing? What are their, habits online? And it's because, it can have a huge influence on us. And so my character, as she's looking for the real killer, is also essentially like making a case for herself to try to persuade people, maybe if she goes to trial, but also just for, public opinion, because, that matters a lot too. Is the DA's appetite for this going to trial, as high if a bunch of people seem to be on her side and she's presenting. So I think it's so interesting that you can use technology to sort of shape reality and outcomes even.
Yeah. I mean, and when you flash forward just with all the deep fake videos now that you see, where, I mean, I think it's always starts off as a toy, right? Oh, it's so much fun. I can put myself in a scene in Pulp Fiction, and I can put my face on Uma Thurman, and isn't that fun? But then you just think, oh my goodness, but if I could do that, at least with Pulp Fiction, everybody knows it's the scene in Pulp Fiction. Like, what happens when this technology becomes so, prevalent that kids can do it to other kids, for example, right? Or, and I think we're getting to the point where technology is so pervasive, but we have to really kind of figure out what we're going to allow and what we, what do we think is slander and libel, given that so many of these things, they excuse it as, oh, but it's a joke, it's clearly farce, right? So, and so where are we going to draw the lines there? And then what do we say when, I mean, I'm a journalism background, as are you, right? So like, we're used to kind of being like free speech no matter what, right?
Yeah.
And I definitely feel that way, but at the same time, you can't yell fire in a theater, right? And so there are all these new ways through social media of kind of yelling fire in a theater. And so where do you draw the line there? And I know this bookstore is connected with the university. And so I wonder if some of the students there are going to be really looking into this and thinking, kind of trying to navigate what are the rules and expectations, and what are we as a society kind of willing to deal with for all the convenience and all the great things that social media has. The fact that we can join a Seattle bookstore from our living rooms at 9 o'clock.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But then, I mentioned, that I want lasagna to my husband as I'm walking out the door, and then I have ads that are popping up for lasagna. Like, it's just, our boundaries and lines are just constantly shifting, and it is really fascinating, and it affects us so much that it's the perfect fertile ground, I think, for writers.
It is. I think one day I might have to do like a gaslighting where this person just keeps getting ads for things that actually are not relevant at all, and they're so used to getting relevant things that they start to wonder if they aren't who they think they are. It would be like
that. Yeah, absolutely. That would be awesome.
Right? Like right now, it's I'm always sitting there and I'm like, yep, yoga pants, you got me. I've been living in them.
Yes.
Instead, it will be like these hot dinner outfits, and I'll be like, who do they think I am?
Yeah. And your account is linked to your husband's account, and then you start to wonder, like, what's he looking up, or what is your adult child looking up, or and then you suspect everyone.
That's right. That's right. See, these ideas just roll off the top of our heads. We're just
ready.
we can
Ready to write it. And I definitely want to mention your main character, Jade, because she's, like you were mentioning, she kind of is an Instagram influencer, which sort of leads into a little bit of what we were talking about. But I just find her to be so fascinating, her background, how she's able to make a living now. Do you want to tell people a little bit about her?
Oh yeah, thanks, Vanessa. I think you know, for me, well, there were two things I wanted to do with Jade. One is that they have these influencer thing. I think we're all kind of figuring out, like, is this a job? Is it a hobby? How some people make a ton of money, and then so, like, what is it? And I really think that these jobs are like they're the new media jobs, right? Like, it used to be where if you were maybe an up and coming designer, you would be trying to get a lot of articles into like House Beautiful and all of these local kind of home magazines and trying to get your name out that way, and you'd be writing articles for them. And that doesn't really exist now in a way that could support somebody, because a lot of these publications have closed down or they've become blogs online. And so I think of it as, so I wanted to kind of give her this new media job where there's still a lot of questions as to whether it's legit. And then I wanted to also infuse her with a lot of my own personal background, because I'm half Jamaican and half Irish American. And I made Jade this Jamaican American character who, you know, I think has to deal, not only that she's a lot younger than her husband to be, but also that she comes from a different culture that has to deal with stereotypes of gold diggers or people that are only marrying for a green card, or, you know, these are kind of some of the baggage that comes with being a Black Caribbean American. And so she's very aware of these stereotypes, and then she's doing her best to kind of not allow anyone to put her in these boxes, but that means this kind of tap dancing about what she's willing to reveal about her background, because anything that she feels would push somebody in that direction, she's very reticent to share. And it's interesting, I watched this, it's on collegehumor.com or something, but they had this couple that goes out on like an interracial date, and it's a Black guy and a Caucasian woman. And the guy is offered like spicy food and hot sauce and shit. And he's like, and you're hearing his internal monologue. And he's like, and I'm not going to have any of that because of the stereotypes associated with it. Right. And so, and so he's making decisions based on not wanting to be stereotyped by his date. And the date is also kind of making decisions based on not wanting to fall into, of not wanting to be like a Karen. Right. So they're both just, they're like, it's this tap dance. And I think sometimes of my own parents who kind of were merging these cultures. My dad we did his 23andMe, and he is like 100% Irish. I mean, it's 99 points something. Both of his parents traced their relatives back like generations to like the same person, because that's what happened in Ireland. And so he was very Irish, and he's the first, you know, son of that generation. And he married my mom, who's Jamaican. And so I think that they had to kind of juggle a lot of these, like, you know, cultural differences and what people had stereotyped the other groups in. And my mom still says to this day that the reason why she knew she could marry my father was she had been asking around, and she kind of been like pushing it to the side. And finally she said, okay, I have a family party. And he went, and he was the minority for like the first time in his life, right? Because it was all Jamaican Americans, and then there's my dad. And she was like, and he did not miss a beat. He was fine. There was no awkwardness. He was just like, hey, you know, and that was when she was like, oh, okay, you know, because he didn't feel like because he was really just seeing it as like, well, this is her family. And he treated it the same way as he would treat anybody going in there to meet their family. So yeah, I wanted to put some of that in, and I hope it was fun. It was fun for me. So I hope that, and I hope some people get that and kind of have fun with seeing the characters melding together. And you are actually including some of your Cherokee heritage, right, in an upcoming book.
Yeah, the book I'm working on right now, I'm setting it in northeastern Oklahoma, which is where I'm originally from. And, kind of as part of writing it, I wanted to think a little bit about what my own Cherokee heritage, and then just kind of questions, because I certainly consider myself a white woman and all of the privilege that has come with that, but at the same time, erasure is a big part of a lot of people's cultural background. And the older I get, in particular, as I've taken the time to really, think about things from how I was raised, or, reading books about, where my family is originally from, because they were on the Trail of Tears, and our family has allotment land, which was given by the government, for after they forced us off of our original land. And so just like kind of thinking about what it means to have a cultural identity, and to just sort of look at how the issues affect you, even if it's not something that is literally, perceived. It's more cultural. And the story itself is, about a woman who is Cherokee, but also white. And so she returns to Oklahoma after her sister disappears, almost exactly 15 years after, on the anniversary of when they both escaped a terrible crime in which they were almost murdered. And so it's sort of, I think, revisiting traumas and revisiting things that happen. And I was listening to, I think, a podcast once, and someone was talking about how we can have trauma in our DNA, that we carry it, generation to generation. And there's just something so eerie and sort of and sad about that idea that, the trauma that happened to your ancestors could still be, living inside of you. It's almost like a ghost. So I'm just sort of trying to explore that a little bit, and both because I think it's important to tell those stories, but also it's just kind of where my mind's been at, over the past year or so.
Yeah, I think it sounds so interesting. And I mean, I grapple with that too, because like this whole the cultural identity versus how you're perceived, because, I mean, being half Black and half white, I have a lot of people that will look at me and be like, Indian or Pakistani or Hispanic. And actually I have no, I have knowledge of those cultures, but I have no like blood attachment to it really. Indian, my mom has some Indian, but other than that. And so it is always this interesting thing with how much of yourself can you own, given that these are the cultures that you grew up with, and this is what comes from your family, versus how you might be treated because of the way people perceive you and what ethnicity or culture they think you are. And I know my kids, I mean, my husband's Swedish. And so once you got the Irish and the Swedish together, they made like, they're just very fair, blonde-haired, blue-eyed children. Like, it's just the way it came out, right? Meanwhile, I had spent all this time telling my husband, like, just to be clear, the kids could come out darker, that we don't know how genes work. I did all of this prep, and then because I just didn't want any kind of like, I don't know, shocking things in the delivery room where he's like, that's not my baby. And meanwhile, then I had them, and all I could think of was, that's not my baby. Like, they're beautiful little babies, but I was looking and I was like, no, that's not, I mean, they're blonde. Like, and so my kids always have this thing where they will, when people ask them, there's kind of an expectation, because the way they look, that they should say that they're white, but then that's erasing the fact that they're a quarter Black, and that I'm also a Jamaican citizen. They have gone to Jamaica. Like, I mean, we went to Jamaica just 5 times this past year, right? So this is definitely like part of their culture. My mom and dad live a couple towns over. So, it's like they eat Jamaican food, and this is very much part of who they are. even though they don't present with the idea of what people think of as Jamaican. So yeah, I think that that's kind of a rich subject to be delving into. I see that Dan's back, so.
Hi.
Yeah, I got a few questions for you.
Oh, nice.
What are some tips you could offer aspiring writers about plotting a thriller? Vanessa had mentioned that you were particularly adept at plotting out your novels. Could you give them some of the aspiring writers in the audience tips?
Yes. So I think, so I'm a little insane as Vanessa. I love these like Excel spreadsheets. And so I use them for writing. And I think I start off where there's an A storyline, a B storyline, and sometimes a C storyline. And then you go chapter by chapter with your columns on the left, and you really try and hit, this is how your A storyline is going to develop. These are the plot points. So and also it keeps you from getting any storyline lost, right? Because if you don't want to have a book where you mention the C storyline in like chapter 2 and it never shows up again until chapter 15, because then people forget it. So it helps you kind of really look at that and go, okay, this is how this A plot's going to develop. Then this is how the B plot's going to develop. Here's going to where they're going to link, because you have to have everything kind of link at different points. And I think if you can see that all laid out in cells that you can move around, it's really kind of helpful. Other people might have different programs. I just feel that Excel tends to come when you buy the Microsoft Word suite. So
Might as well use it.
Might as well use it. Yeah, I mean, and Vanessa, how about you? What do you think for plotting? What's some advice?
So the first books I wrote, so by the time my debut, Little Voices, was published, I've been trying to be published for about 13 years. And so some of the books I wrote before my debut, I actually wrote, typically it's called, do you write by the seat of your pants? So you just kind of sit down and go, pantsters, or you a plotter and you do much more extensive plotting. So I used to kind of write by the seat of my pants, but the problem is I just would go down so many rabbit holes that my books would be way too long. And it was so hard for me to get my arms around the story. And that's really important in the editing process. So for both of these books, I did try to change up my process, which is hard, but the book I use that really helped me is called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. So there's a Save the Cat book, which is about a screenplay, and it's great, and it actually would help you too. But an author named Jessica Brody took that structure and applied it all to novel writing. And there's so many examples. She spells everything out. So if you're kind of wanting to explore plot, in a really pragmatic way, that's a great book. But this book I'm reading now, which I've now mentioned 3 times, Story Genius, she has this really fascinating point that I was just writing notes on earlier today while my kid was not listening to the teacher in music class. And she basically says that, plot is obviously important, but often where we need to start is actually character. And particularly what change will your character go through through the novel? So like, what is that process? And then what events need to happen to get them there to the new place? What great change needs to happen? So it isn't like, you don't need to think of it like I build a plot and then my character goes through the gauntlet. It's actually more what plot points will serve my character making it through those huge changes that make a story compelling.
Right. I mean, I think I take it where it's a little bit of back and forth. Like I plot everything out, and then including I have another page where it's like my character arcs and where I think they're going to have their big changes. That's and then as I'm writing, like things change. So you're just like, oh, you know what? The characters, the way they're developing, they're not going to do that. Like I thought they would. And then you go back and you tear it up. I feel for me, I always like to have that roadmap of knowing, okay, here are the main points that I'm going to be trying to hit in this chapter, or here's, I'm leading up to at the end of my first act when my character is going to realize, oh, the things that they thought were true, they're going to start to doubt it. And that's going to have an emotional effect on them. And that will lead them to maybe be more brash in the future or less trusting or whatever it is that's going to change them. And I should mention my agent, Paula Meunier, wrote Plot Perfect, which is another like really good plot book. So I'll give her a shout out, and it definitely helps. It's good to have an agent that literally wrote the book on plot, because if your plot has a problem, she's like,
she can spell it out for you.
Yeah.
Vanessa touched on something that the next question, I think it kind of fits in with the next question. What do you think literary thrillers from a storytelling aspect do better than movie thrillers?
Oh.
I don't know, but some movie thrillers have done so well. I feel like.
Well, I think they just mean like in the terms of the difference between when you read a thriller as opposed to going to the movie theaters and seeing a thriller. What do you think the
big difference?
Not the big difference, because obviously it's page versus the screen, but what do you think the literary thrillers, kind of what immediacy do they have that's better than a movie thriller, or can do better than a movie thriller?
Well, I think particularly for our genre in psychological thriller, you get to, like, in the book, you're in the characters' heads, right? So you get to, because it's the thing about movies is that you're always third person, right? Unless you're going to write a movie with a ton of voiceover, which I think was done successfully, maybe with Memento. But otherwise, a lot of voiceover sometimes is just kind of like, okay, why don't I just read the book, right? And so the great thing about books is you are in the character's head and you are perceiving everything so clearly through their eyes, through their perspective. And then that adds another bit of tension, because you just don't know if what you're seeing is accurate, right? Because they are your eyes and ears, and they're your filter. And even when you do close third, you kind of jump back and forth between, kind of seeing it from a third person perspective where maybe it's a bit more accurate, and then you're back into how the character is perceiving it and interpreting all that information. So I think that that's really cool. Also, I think it draws you in, kind of forces an empathy, because you are in that character's body and situation, trying to understand what they're trying to understand, and trying to kind of figure things out and grow with them and react emotionally to the things that they're reacting to. And so I think that kind of creates this like empathy bond that is sometimes missing in movies, because with movies it's all about like, did something blow up? It's like they have to do something to kind of to get you in it, because it's hard to walk in that character's shoes when you're always looking at them like from that perspective. So that's what I would say. Vanessa?
I also think so. Like an adaptation that I really liked is Gone Girl's adaptation.
Yes.
I feel like in some ways it was almost a little stronger than the book, because it was so lean. It was a little bit leaner. But the thing is, looking back, I've seen the movie several times and I've read it several times. But the twists themselves, like the big twist with Amy, like that's cool on the screen. And even, if I didn't know, like twists and things are cool and maybe a little bit shocking, but the reaction you have because you are in that character's head, because like to me, there's no comparison to like when a book scares you or shocks you, you feel it in every part of your body. And then a TV show or movie is like, ooh, oh, that's interesting. It's such a different, because you are in a third person role, you are an observer. Whereas a book tries to shut off the part of you that thinks about you being in a chair. It wants you to be in the story. And that's just such a deeper, more immersive experience, and one in which you kind of manipulate as the author. So, movies certainly have little ways of doing that, but I think the way you actually pull all the threads together, the red herrings, and, push the reader one way and the next based on the chapters and what you set up for them and what they hear. I mean, everything is sort of your movements and your ideas. So I do think you have a lot more power and control over the viewer reader as a writer, because you're bringing them into that world.
Yeah.
Great. Another question is, who are your favorite thriller, domestic suspense, or crime writers that you think deserve more exposure, or just were, are your favorites currently or big influences on you?
Well, one's here.
No, I love Kate.
Outside of present company.
But other than, yeah, I mean, I'll just throw out some. I mean, I think our writing partners with Kimberly Ballett and Lane Fargo are great. I also really love Wendy Walker. I think she's great. Riley Sager, Liv Constantine, which is two people, two sisters, but together they write as Liv Constantine. I think they're great. I also really like Alexia Gordon. If you like things that are a little bit more on the cozy side, she does some great, some kind of great whodunits, and she sets them in Ireland, and it's and her main character Jessamine Brown is very, very cool. And so yeah, that's and who else I mean, there's so many. I just think I think there's so much good work going on right now in our genre. And so Vanessa, how about you want to make some shout outs?
Yeah, so I loved Winter Counts by David Haskell and Aubrey Wyden. It's an incredible kind of vigilante story set on a native reservation. I also really loved, and this is a debut, another debut that I really loved, several actually. The S.A. Cosby's Blacktop Wasteland.
Oh, yeah, that was good.
Absolutely incredible thriller about a man who's trying to kind of go down the good path, but he just happens to be the best getaway driver west of the Mississippi. Or east of the Mississippi. Anyway, so it's great. And I actually just read Steph Chaw's first standalone, Your House Will Pay. It's an incredible book set, told from both a Korean American perspective and a Black male perspective, set in the time of the Rodney King riots. And it's a really compelling, gorgeously told thriller. And I really loved Miracle Creek by Angie Kim that came out 2019. That's another kind of, I was in a debut group, so a lot of these like debuts are always fresh in my head, but those are all, really great stories. And I think particularly like there's, if you are a big reader of domestic suspense, that's fantastic. I would just say, look at your bookshelves and make sure you're not just reading white women as a white woman, because the shelves are heavy with that. And thankfully there are authors like Cate who bring their own kind of cultural heritage and generously share those details with readers. And I think that, we now fortunately have more of those voices available. So you might have to just look a little bit, but it's definitely worth it to have just more of a variety of stories. It's every year it gets a little bit better, but we still have a long way to go.
And one final question. Both of you talked so much about how you've incorporated modern technology in your fiction. Do either of you have any notions of doing something more period based? And the questioner asked like 80s or earlier, maybe doing something where the technology isn't present there.
Yeah, well, we had The Young Rich Widows, which is 1985. And I think other than one rich character having a brick cell phone, right? Because we're like, almost for comedic sake, like, yeah, there's the technology really isn't there. There's no like computer that they go to download the files. It's like, that's, and that was fun. That was freeing. For the first time, you could have our characters run around and not have to like get rid of their GPS tracking, because it's always funny when everyone thinks, oh, there's going to be GPS tracking in a vaccine. It's like, there's GPS tracking in your phone, in that thing that you have in your back pocket all the time. And I know, because as a writer, I'm trying to get rid of it all the time, So wasn't that freeing? And I hope we get to do that more. I hope we get to write some, more sequels.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to write different time periods, though I find it intimidating. I feel like to write a great historical, it has to be so immersive. And the ones that I read, it's just, I can't hardly believe it wasn't actually written then, because often they're just so vibrant and realistic. So I would be really interested in that. But I just would have to really feel confident in my research and my ability to tell that story.
Yeah, I recently reread Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and the fact that all takes place in like the 70s, and that
Yeah.
they have to go down to the archive and look through boxes and boxes of paper copies. I love this question. It's like this idea of how do you do something in an era that you're not really familiar with, and all of the easy kind of solutions are no longer solutions, but some of also the problems are not the problems either.
Right.
Right.
They have very different problems, like the microfiche machine not working or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Cate and Vanessa, for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. And a huge thank you to our audience for spending an hour with us here at University Bookstore. This event will soon be available on the University Bookstore YouTube channel, and the books are available for purchase on ubookstore.com. Thank you,
Great.
everyone, and good night.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks for having
Bye.
us. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.